the bodies float in canals that once carried flowers and songs. 40,000 corpses bob against stone embankments where children played 3 months ago, their flesh blackened by August heat, bloated beyond recognition, their bones showing through where fish and dogs have fed. The water that sustained a city of 200,000 water that flowed clear from Chapultepec springs through ingenious aqueducts now carries only death, thick with decomposing flesh and the waste of the dying. The stench hangs over Tenochtitlan like a physical presence, so overwhelming that even Spanish soldiers hardened by years of warfare wrap cloth around their faces. On the rooftops of buildings not yet demolished, the living gaunt, hollow-eyed, barely breathing watch Spanish brigantines patrol Lake Texcoco like predators circling prey. Their ribs show through skin stretched tight over wasting bodies. Children too weak to cry lie in their mother's arms. Warriors who once carried obsidian-edged clubs now stumble when they try to stand. They have eaten leather boiled soft over fires. They have chewed bark until their gums bled. They have scraped moss from stones, mixed mud with water and forced it down their throats. Some have consumed the mortar between stones, anything to fill the void where their stomachs once were. In 93 days, the largest city in the Americas has become a tomb where the dead outnumber the living. It is the 13th of August 1521, and summer heat bakes the Valley of Mexico. The siege that began in May is ending, not in surrender, not in negotiation, but in obliteration. Among the survivors, a 25-year-old emperor named Cuauhtemoc kneels in a canoe, trying to flee across water that was supposed to protect his people. Spanish soldiers haul him aboard a brigantine. His hands, which once commanded armies, are bound. His city, Tenochtitlan, the floating miracle of canals and temples that Cortés himself compared to Venice, burns behind him. The Templo Mayor, where priests once climbed 60 meters to touch the sky, collapses into rubble. Markets that fed thousands fall silent. The causeways where Moctezuma once walked in jaguar skins to greet a stranger are choked with the dead. This is how empires end. Not with glory, not with fate, with hunger, disease, and the sound of bodies settling into canals. But to understand how Tenochtitlan fell, you must first understand what it was when it stood. Welcome to Whispered Empires, where we uncover the human moments beneath history's grand narratives, the choices, the betrayals, the moments when everything changes. Today, we're asking a question that haunted conquistadors and historians alike. How did 500 Spanish soldiers destroy an empire of 6 million people? How did Hernán Cortés, a 34-year-old adventurer with no royal backing and a handful of horses, topple a civilization that had dominated Mesoamerica for 200 years? The answer isn't what you've been told. It wasn't superior weaponry. It wasn't divine providence. It was gold, manipulation, disease, and the terrible mathematics of betrayal. On a February morning in 1519, 11 Spanish ships cut through Caribbean waters toward the Yucatan Peninsula, their sails fat with wind, their holds packed with weapons and ambition. At the prow of the flagship stood Hernán Cortés, born to minor nobility in Medellin, Spain, in 1485. A man with more ambition than scruples and a talent for turning disadvantage into opportunity. His father had been a captain of infantry, respectable but not wealthy. His mother came from a family with noble blood but little money. Cortés himself had studied law at the University of Salamanca for 2 years before boredom and restlessness drove him to the Americas in 1504. He had sailed to Hispaniola at age 19, seeking fortune in a world where men with quick minds and quicker swords could rise above their birth. For 7 years he lived as a notary and farmer, competent but frustrated, watching others claim glory while he counted crops. Then in 1511, opportunity arrived in the form of Diego Velázquez's expedition to conquer Cuba. Cortés joined, distinguished himself in combat, and rose to become mayor of Santiago de Cuba and Velázquez's trusted confidant. He married Velázquez's sister-in-law. He acquired land and indigenous slaves. He seemed destined for colonial prosperity, a comfortable retirement as a wealthy planter. But comfort bored Cortés. Glory called to him like a siren song. When Velázquez commissioned him to lead an expedition to the Mexican mainland in 1518, ostensibly to trade and explore, not conquer, Cortés sensed the governor's ambivalence. The commission came with restrictions, warnings, an undertone of mistrust. Velázquez feared this particular subordinate would overreach, would transform a commercial venture into something more dangerous and profitable. He was right. When Velázquez tried to rescind the commission at the last moment, sensing Cortés's true intentions, the would-be conquistador simply ignored the order. He provisioned his ships, recruited soldiers willing to risk everything for gold and glory, and sailed from Cuba on the 18th of February 1519 before Velázquez could stop him. It was outright mutiny. If he failed, he would hang. If he succeeded spectacularly enough, the king might overlook his insubordination. Now at 34, he was defying the governor who had ordered him not to leave, commanding 500 soldiers, 100 sailors, 16 horses, and 11 ships stuffed with crossbows, harquebuses, and a handful of small cannons. It was not an army, it was a gamble. Every man aboard knew it. Some had signed on for adventure. Most came for gold. A few brought religious zeal, genuinely believing they would save pagan souls through Spanish steel and Catholic conversion. Cortés understood all their motivations because he shared them. He wanted gold. He wanted glory. He wanted power. And he possessed a gift for understanding what others wanted and using that knowledge to bend them to his will. He was charismatic when needed, ruthless when necessary, and willing to burn every bridge behind him if it meant moving forward. He had no intention of failing. In March, Cortés's ships made landfall at Tabasco. The local Maya resisted. The Spanish responded with cavalry charges. The Maya had never witnessed men and animals moving as one terrible creature, cutting through warriors like cornstalks. 800 Tabascans died. 2 Spaniards fell. The battle lasted hours. The lesson was instantaneous. Spanish steel, Spanish tactics, Spanish horses changed the calculus of war. Among the tribute the defeated Maya offered were 20 women. One of them would reshape history more than any weapon Cortés carried. Her name was Malintzin, though the Spanish would call her Doña Marina and later La Malinche. She was perhaps 20 years old, born to Nahua nobility, sold into slavery after her father died. She spoke Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs, and Chontal Maya. When combined with a shipwrecked Spaniard named Geronimo de Aguilar, who spoke Spanish and Chontal Maya, Cortés suddenly possessed something more valuable than gold, a way to understand his enemies. La Malinche became his interpreter, his advisor, his intelligence officer. She would bear him a son. She would guide him through political landscapes he could never navigate alone. Centuries later, her name would become synonymous with betrayal in Mexico, a woman who sold her people for proximity to power. The truth, as always, was more complicated. She was a survivor in a world that gave women few tools for survival. On the 21st of April 1519, the Spanish fleet landed near what would become Veracruz. Cortés established a settlement and did something calculated to burn all bridges. He wrote directly to King Charles V, bypassing the Cuban governor entirely, claiming vast new territories for Spain and seeking royal endorsement for his unauthorized expedition. He was either a genius or a dead man. The king would decide. While waiting for a response that might never come, Cortés encountered representatives of the Totonac people, subjects of the Aztec Empire who paid tribute in goods and blood. They told him about Tenochtitlan, about Moctezuma, about an empire held together through tribute and fear. Cortés listened and smiled, because he had just learned the great secret of the Aztec Empire. Everyone hated it. To understand what Tenochtitlan was in 1519, you must imagine a city that should not exist. Built on islands in Lake Texcoco, 5 square miles of human determination challenging geography itself, the Mexica people, whom we call Aztecs, had founded it in 1325, following a prophecy. They would settle where they saw an eagle perched on a cactus, devouring a serpent. On a swampy island, they saw their sign. 2 centuries later, they had built one of the greatest cities on earth. 3 causeways connected Tenochtitlan to the mainland, each wide enough for 10 horses to ride abreast. Wooden bridges could be removed at night or during war, turning the island into a fortress. Canals laced through the city like veins, so residents could travel by foot or canoe to any neighborhood. Chinampas floating gardens anchored to the lake bed produced corn, beans, squash, and chilies in quantities that fed hundreds of thousands. 2 aqueducts brought fresh water from Chapultepec Springs, solving the problem of living surrounded by brackish lake water. At the city's heart stood the sacred precinct, a walled enclosure of temples and palaces. The Templo Mayor dominated the skyline, 60 meters of stepped stone painted in reds and blues so vivid they seemed to bleed in sunlight. At its summit, twin shrines honored Huitzilopochtli, god of war and the sun, and Tlaloc, god of rain. Human hearts were offered there, cut from living chests by obsidian blades, the blood running down steps, worn smooth by centuries of sacrifice. The city housed 200,000 souls, though some estimates climbed to 400,000. Either figure made Tenochtitlan larger than any European city save Paris, Venice, and Constantinople. It was 5 times the size of London. The Spanish, when they first glimpsed it across the water, thought they were dreaming. The market at Tlatelolco, Tenochtitlan's sister district, could hold 60,000 people on peak trading days. Vendors sold everything: jade from the south, obsidian from the north, cacao, vanilla, jaguar pelts, quetzal feathers worth more than gold. There were sections for food, for cloth, for pottery, for precious metals. Officials monitored every transaction, ensuring honest weights and measures. The Spanish chronicler Bernal Díaz del Castillo would later write that it surpassed anything he had seen in Constantinople or Rome. But beauty and sophistication masked a darker truth. Tenochtitlan's power rested on the backs of 400 subject city-states stretching from the Gulf Coast to the Pacific. These tributary peoples sent food, cotton, cacao, jade, and most importantly, captives for sacrifice. The Aztec calendar demanded blood. Thousands died annually atop the Templo Mayor, their hearts lifted to the sun to ensure it would rise again. To the Aztecs, this was cosmic maintenance, keeping the universe in motion. To their subjects, it was horror. The Tlaxcalans, fierce warriors occupying territory east of Tenochtitlan, had resisted Aztec expansion for decades. They lived in a state of chronic warfare, raiding and being raided, losing sons to Aztec sacrifice stones. They had reasons, decades of reasons, to hate Moctezuma. Cortés would exploit every single one. Moctezuma II had ruled since 1502. He was approximately 53 years old in 1519, a warrior priest who had expanded Aztec territories further south than any predecessor. His palace occupied 200 meters on each side, filled with 300 rooms, gardens, aviaries, and even a private zoo. Spanish chroniclers claimed he owned thousands of mantles he never wore twice. He dined behind screens while musicians played, and servants tasted his food before it reached his lips. But Moctezuma was not the superstitious coward Spanish propaganda would paint. He was a seasoned military commander, a competent administrator, and a man trying to navigate an impossible situation. When reports reached him in early 1519 of strange men landing on the coast, men with pale skin, beards, thunder weapons, and animals that carried warriors into battle, he faced a dilemma. Attack immediately? Risk provoking war during planting season, which could mean famine. Wait and gather intelligence? Give the strangers time to forge alliances with tributary states. The legend that Moctezuma believed Cortés was the god Quetzalcoatl returning from the east is likely Spanish fabrication, written after the fact to justify conquest. Modern historians find little evidence Moctezuma confused Cortés for anything but what he was: a foreign invader of uncertain strength and dangerous potential. Moctezuma chose a middle path. He sent emissaries with lavish gifts, gold, discs, silver, featherwork, hoping to impress the Spanish into leaving. The messengers also carried a message: "You are not welcome in Tenochtitlan. Turn back." Cortés saw the gold. He smiled and marched inland. In August 1519, the Spanish expedition moved west from Veracruz toward the Mexican interior. They numbered perhaps 600 Europeans now. Cortés had convinced some of the men sent to arrest him to join his cause instead, plus thousands of Totonac porters. The route took them through mountainous terrain, up from coastal lowlands into the volcanic highlands of central Mexico. In September, they entered Tlaxcalan territory. The Tlaxcalans, not knowing who these strangers were or whose side they represented, attacked. The resulting battles were fierce. Spanish horses, steel swords, and crossbows gave the conquistadors tactical advantages. But Tlaxcalan warriors numbered in the tens of thousands and fought with the ferocity of a people who had never surrendered. After several bloody encounters, Tlaxcalan leaders sued for peace. They sat down with Cortés, heard through La Malinche about Spanish intentions toward Tenochtitlan, and made a calculation that would doom the Aztec Empire. The enemy of my enemy is my ally. The Tlaxcalans pledged thousands of warriors to the Spanish cause. They would provide food, guides, intelligence. In return, they believed Cortés would help them destroy Aztec power forever and establish Tlaxcalan dominance in the region. It was the first great betrayal. It would not be the last. With Tlaxcalan warriors at his back, Cortés marched toward Tenochtitlan. Between him and the capital lay Cholula, a sacred city of over 30,000 people, home to the Great Pyramid of Quetzalcoatl and allied with the Aztecs. Moctezuma hoped Cholula would stall or stop the Spanish advance. Instead, it became the site of an atrocity that would echo across Mexico. On the 18th of October 1519, Cortés received intelligence, possibly from La Malinche, who had befriended some Cholulan noblewomen during the few days the Spanish had lodged in the city, that the city planned to ambush the Spanish. La Malinche claimed a noblewoman had warned her to flee, saying all the foreigners would be killed. Tlaxcalan scouts reported seeing fortifications being built, weapons gathered in temples, pits dug in streets to trap Spanish horses. Cortés himself later claimed he saw stones piled on rooftops, ready to be hurled down on passing soldiers. Whether the plot was real or invented, whether Cholula truly planned massacre or Cortés manufactured pretext for one remains debated by historians. Tlaxcalan hatred of Cholula was ancient and deep. The Tlaxcalans may have fabricated or exaggerated evidence to provoke Spanish attack on their old enemy. La Malinche, navigating her own survival, may have believed genuinely in the threat, or may have understood what Cortés wanted to hear. Cortés himself, facing a city allied with Moctezuma and blocking the road to Tenochtitlan, may have decided that terror served his purposes better than negotiation. What happened next is not debated. Cortés summoned Cholula's nobles to the courtyard of the temple of Quetzalcoatl under the pretext of a meeting. Hundreds came the cream of Cholulan society, priests and administrators, military commanders and wealthy merchants. They came unarmed, dressed in their finest cotton and featherwork, believing this was a diplomatic gathering. When they filled the courtyard, Spanish soldiers moved quietly to block every exit, every archway, every door, every possible escape route. Then Cortés, standing above the crowd, made a speech. He accused the Cholulans of treachery, of plotting murder, of betraying hospitality. He declared this treason against Spain and against God. Then he gave the order his men had been waiting for. Gunfire erupted from all sides, harquebuses spitting fire and led into packed bodies at point-blank range. Crossbows released their bolts, punching through flesh and bone. Spanish swords, Toledo steel, honed to razor edges, rose and fell in mechanical rhythm, hacking through cotton armor that offered no protection, severing arms mid-defense, opening throats and chests. Men tried to flee and found exits blocked by armored soldiers. They tried to fight back and discovered they had nothing to fight with. No weapons, no armor, nowhere to run. Within minutes, the courtyard ran red. Bodies piled on bodies. The screaming stopped as Spanish blades found throats. Outside the temple, Tlaxcalan warriors 4,000 strong, waiting for this moment, poured into Cholula like a flood through a broken dam. They had hated this city for generations, fought wars against it, lost sons to its warriors and priests. Now came vengeance unlimited. They went from house to house, slaughtering everyone they found. They burned temples that had honored gods they despised. They looted homes and murdered families. Elderly Cholulans were hacked down in their doorways. Women were raped and killed. Spanish chroniclers would later claim the Tlaxcalans committed worse atrocities than the Spanish, as if it mattered who held the blade when throats were cut. The massacre lasted 2 days. Smoke from burning buildings turned day into twilight. Blood ran in the streets in literal streams, pooling in low places, soaking into the earth. Dogs fed on corpses. Vultures circled overhead in clouds so thick they darkened the sky. In 2 hours, Spanish weapons and Tlaxcalan rage killed 3,000 people in the temple courtyard alone. Over the next 48 hours, the death toll climbed to 5,000 or 6,000. Estimates vary because no one counted corpses, they simply piled them for burning. Francisco López de Gomara, Cortés's secretary, would later write that they had punished Cholulan treachery. Bernardino de Sahagún, who arrived in Mexico after the conquest and interviewed survivors, recorded indigenous accounts saying the victims were unarmed civilians murdered in cold blood. Both versions contain truth. The Cholulans may have plotted ambush. The Spanish certainly committed atrocity. What mattered was not the truth, but the message sent across the Valley of Mexico. Spanish mercy is not guaranteed. Resistance invites annihilation. Submission might allow survival. When news of Cholula reached Tenochtitlan, Moctezuma's options narrowed like a noose tightening. Resistance had failed. Bribery had failed. Diplomacy had failed. The strangers kept coming, now swollen with indigenous allies and drunk on gold and blood. On the 8th of November 1519, Moctezuma made a choice that would haunt him to his grave. He invited Cortés into Tenochtitlan. Perhaps he believed he could control them inside the city. Perhaps he hoped proximity would reveal Spanish weaknesses. Perhaps he still believed diplomacy could succeed where force had failed. We will never know his full reasoning. What we know is that on that bright autumn day, Moctezuma walked across the southern causeway to greet Hernán Cortés. The two men met on stone above shimmering water. Moctezuma wore quetzal feathers and jade. Cortés wore steel and leather. They exchanged gifts. Cortés received gold calendars he would later melt for bullion. Moctezuma received trinkets and promises. Neither man trusted the other. Both smiled. Cortés and his soldiers took up residence in the palace of Axayacatl, Moctezuma's deceased father. The palace was spacious enough to house hundreds. Moctezuma provided food, entertainment, women. For 6 days, an uneasy peace held. The Spanish marveled at the city, the floating gardens, the markets, the pyramids. They also noted the gold, the jade, the wealth that surrounded them. On the 14th of November 1519, Cortés made his move. Claiming that Aztec officials had attacked Spanish soldiers in Veracruz, he demanded that Moctezuma move into Spanish quarters as a guest. The word used was guest. The reality was hostage. Moctezuma, surrounded by armed Spaniards in his own capital, agreed. Whether he went willingly, believing cooperation would eventually lead to Spanish departure, or under direct threat of violence, the outcome was the same. The emperor of 6 million people became a prisoner in his father's palace. For 6 months, an extraordinary fiction played out. Moctezuma continued to rule, issuing orders and receiving tributary payments, but every decision passed through Cortés. The emperor attended mass. He played dice with his captors. Spanish soldiers who disrespected him were punished. Cortés needed Moctezuma's authority intact to keep the city docile. But everyone understood the truth. The Spanish had taken Tenochtitlan without a battle, holding it through the person of its emperor. Aztec nobles watched with growing fury. Their emperor, who had conquered territories from the Pacific to the Gulf, who had expanded the empire to its greatest extent, now played prisoner to a handful of foreign invaders. Resentment simmered. Whispers spread through the city. How long would Moctezuma tolerate this humiliation? How long would his people? If you enjoy uncovering hidden histories like this, hit subscribe. We're only halfway through this story, and the worst is yet to come. In May 1520, runners brought Cortés devastating news. A larger Spanish force had landed at Veracruz, led by Panfilo de Narvaez, sent by Cuba's governor to arrest Cortés for mutiny. The force numbered over 1,000 men, twice Cortés's strength, with orders to drag him back to Cuba in chains. Cortés faced a choice: stay in Tenochtitlan and lose everything, or march to the coast and risk losing the city. He chose action, leaving Pedro de Alvarado, one of his most trusted but least diplomatic captains, in charge of 80 Spaniards and a few hundred Tlaxcalan allies. Cortés marched east with the majority of his forces. Against all odds, Cortés defeated Narvaez in a surprise night attack. Better yet, he convinced most of Narvaez's soldiers to join him. Now he commanded over 1,300 Spaniards he had won. He was returning to Tenochtitlan in triumph, but Alvarado had made a catastrophic error. On the 22nd of May 1520, during Cortés's absence, Aztec nobles requested permission to celebrate Toxcatl, a major religious festival honoring the god Tezcatlipoca. The ceremony would include elaborate costumes, drumming, dancing, a spectacular display of Aztec culture. Alvarado agreed, perhaps seeing it as a harmless diversion. But as hundreds of unarmed nobles gathered in the courtyard of the Templo Mayor, dressed in their finest featherwork and jewels, drumming and dancing in ritual celebration. Alvarado became convinced, either through genuine paranoia or calculated cruelty, that the ceremony masked preparation for an attack. He ordered his men to seal the exits and open fire. When Cortés returned in late June with his expanded force, he found Tenochtitlan in open revolt. Moctezuma, stripped of his people's respect by months of collaboration with invaders, tried to speak to the crowds from a palace rooftop, urging them to let the Spanish leave peacefully. The crowd pelted him with stones. According to Spanish accounts, one stone struck Moctezuma in the head. He died 3 days later from his wounds, heartbroken that his own people had rejected him. Aztec accounts claim the Spanish murdered him, no longer needing a puppet whose authority had evaporated. We will never know with certainty which version is truth. Both may be. What is certain is that on the 29th of June, 1520, Moctezuma II died. The man who had ruled the Aztec Empire for 18 years, who had expanded it to its greatest extent, who had hosted Cortés with gold and women and hope for peace, died either by his people's fury or Spanish treachery. His body was never shown. His nephew, Cuitláhuac, took the throne and vowed vengeance. Cortés realized his position was untenable. Surrounded by a hostile city, outnumbered thousands to one, running low on food and water, he made the only choice available: retreat. On the night of the 30th of June 1520, a night the Spanish would remember as La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows, Cortés ordered his forces to evacuate Tenochtitlan under cover of darkness and rain. Soldiers wrapped their armor in cloth to muffle sound. They constructed a portable bridge to cross canal gaps where the Aztecs had destroyed the causeway bridges. For a few precious hours, they moved undetected through the sleeping city. Then, a woman drawing water from a canal spotted them. Her scream shattered the night. Within minutes, drums thundered across Tenochtitlan. Warriors poured from every building. Canoes filled with archers launched from every canal. The fleeing Spanish, burdened with looted gold bars, chains, discs, found themselves attacked from all sides on the narrow Tacuba causeway. The portable bridge broke under weight. Gaps in the causeway became killing zones. Warriors in canoes fired arrows point-blank into Spanish soldiers trapped between water and stone. Men in armor, loaded down with gold, sank like stones when they fell into Lake Texcoco. Horses screamed and thrashed. Tlaxcalan allies died by the hundred. Estimates vary wildly on casualties. Cortés claimed 154 Spaniards died. Other accounts put the number between 450 and over 1,000. What all agree on, it was a slaughter. Perhaps half the Spanish force perished. Over 1,000 Tlaxcalan allies fell. All the artillery was lost. Most of the horses died. The gold Cortés had killed and schemed for sank into the lake or was recaptured by the Aztecs. Cortés reportedly wept beneath a tree on the mainland, watching his expedition disintegrate. But he did not surrender. The survivors staggered northeast toward Tlaxcala, harried by Aztec forces. On the 7th of July, 1520, at Otumba, a massive Aztec army intercepted them. Outnumbered perhaps 10 to 1, the Spanish formed a defensive square and fought with the desperation of men who had nothing left to lose. According to Cortés, he personally killed the Aztec commander, and the indigenous army scattered. More likely, the Aztec forces withdrew after suffering heavy casualties and achieving their primary goal, expelling the invaders from the Valley of Mexico. Either way, the Spanish reached Tlaxcala alive. They expected to rest, to recover, to plan revenge. Instead, an enemy far deadlier than any army arrived in Tenochtitlan that autumn. Spanish soldiers massacred the dancers where they stood. Swords hacked through featherwork and flesh. Crossbow bolts punched through dancers mid-step. In minutes, hundreds died. Nobles, priests, the cream of Aztec society. The courtyard ran red. The drums stopped. The festival became a slaughter. When news spread through Tenochtitlan, the city exploded into rage. Every quarter rose in rebellion. Warriors swarmed the Spanish position. The 80 soldiers Alvarado commanded barricaded themselves in the palace, surrounded by tens of thousands of furious Aztecs hurling stones, shooting arrows, setting fires. For weeks, the Spanish clung to survival by their fingernails, protected only by their hostage emperor. The virus found a virgin population, millions of people, with no immunity, no resistance, no ancestral exposure that might have granted even partial protection. In Europe, smallpox had circulated for centuries. Survivors carried lifetime immunity. Outbreaks killed some, mostly children and the elderly, but left most adults scarred but alive. The Spanish soldiers had either survived childhood smallpox or watched others die from it. They understood the disease's progression, its dangers, its ultimate mercy of immunity for survivors. The Mexica and their neighbors had never seen smallpox. They had no word for it in Nahuatl. They would call it Huizahuatl, the great leprosy, and Totemonalistli, the pustules. Neither name captured its horror. By September 1520, smallpox reached Tenochtitlan. The city, still recovering from driving out the Spanish, still celebrating Cuitlahuac's leadership and preparing for a renewed war, suddenly faced an enemy that could not be fought with obsidian blades or Aztec courage. The disease spreads through multiple vectors: respiratory droplets from coughing or speaking, direct contact with pustules or scabs, contaminated cloth or blankets, even objects touched by infected hands. In a city of 200,000 packed onto an island of 5 square miles, where extended families shared single rooms, where people gathered daily in markets and temples, where social bonds meant constant physical proximity, the virus moved like fire through dry grass. The symptoms appeared within 10 to 14 days of exposure. It began with what seemed like flu. Fever spiking to dangerous levels, headache that felt like the skull was splitting, back pain so severe victims could not stand. For 3 or 4 days, the infected suffered these symptoms while remaining contagious, spreading virus to everyone around them. Then came the rash, first small red spots across the face and body, inside the mouth and throat. Within 2 days, these spots became raised bumps. Within another day or two, the bumps filled with thick fluid, becoming pustules that covered every inch of skin. The pain was beyond description. Pustules formed on eyelids, inside mouths, on genitals, between fingers and toes, across backs and stomachs. They formed inside throats, making swallowing agony. Lying down pressed pustules against bedding, causing excruciating pressure. Sitting up offered no relief. Pustules covered buttocks and backs. Victims could not drink without pain. They could not eat. Movement, any movement, was torture. The pustules scabbed over in the second week, if victims survived that long. As scabs formed, they tightened skin, pulling and cracking. Removing scabs caused bleeding and potential infection. Leaving them meant weeks of discomfort. When scabs finally fell away, they left permanent scars, deep pits, in skin that would mark survivors for life. Approximately 1/3 of smallpox victims died, usually in the second week as the disease attacked internal organs. Another third went blind as pustules destroyed the delicate tissues of eyes. Only a fortunate third survived with scars, but intact vision and health. Aztec codices created after the conquest depict the horror with stark clarity. Human figures covered in dots representing pustules, bodies lying prone because sitting or standing was impossible, healers attempting remedies that did nothing. One account, collected by Bernardino de Sahagún from Nahua informants years later, describes the progression. A great plague broke out here in Tenochtitlan, striking everywhere in the city and killing a vast number of people. Sores erupted on our faces, our breasts, our bellies. We were covered with agonizing sores from head to foot. The illness was so dreadful that no one could walk or move. The sick were so utterly helpless that they could only lie on their beds like corpses, unable to move their limbs or even their heads. If they did move, they screamed in pain. Many died from this plague, but many died of hunger. There were deaths from starvation, for they had no one left to care for them. All of our people were stricken. No one could walk. No one could rise to bring food. No one could grind corn. The famine was so severe that many simply lay down and died. The epidemic lasted 60 to 70 days in Tenochtitlan, though estimates vary. It killed between 1/3 and 1/2 of the city's population, somewhere between 60,000 and 100,000 people, in a matter of weeks. 5 to 8 million died across central Mexico in the first wave. The disease spread beyond the Valley of Mexico, reaching as far as the Maya territories in Yucatan, and even, according to some accounts, reaching the Inca Empire in South America before Spanish soldiers ever arrived there. Streets that had teemed with commerce fell silent, except for moaning from houses where entire families lay dying. Market vendors who had sold goods every day for decades simply stopped coming. They were dead or dying or tending to dead and dying family members. The chinampas, the floating gardens that fed the city, went untended because farmers were too sick to work or had died leaving no one to replace them. Priests who had climbed the Templo Mayor daily to offer blood to the gods now lay fevered and delirious, covered in pustules, unable to perform the rituals they believed kept the sun rising and the rains falling. The epidemic was indiscriminate in its targets, but disproportionate in its impact. Warriors in their prime fell as quickly as elderly grandparents. Children died en masse, their small bodies unable to withstand fever and dehydration. Nobles who had lived lives of luxury expired in the same pustule-covered agony as commoners. The priests who served in the temples, the administrators who kept records and collected tribute, the military commanders who planned defensive strategies, all were vulnerable. The epidemic decapitated Aztec leadership faster than any Spanish sword could have managed. Emperor Cuitlahuac, who had orchestrated the uprising against the Spanish, who had driven them from the city, who had rallied his people to defend Tenochtitlan against inevitable Spanish return, contracted smallpox in late November or early December 1520. He had ruled for approximately 80 days, his entire reign consumed by war and its aftermath. Now the disease consumed him. He died covered in pustules, unable to move, fevered and delirious, the empire he commanded utterly unable to save him. The gods he had served his entire life did not intervene. The sacrifices he had overseen, the hearts he had offered to Huitzilopochtli, brought no divine protection. The throne passed to Cuauhtemoc, son of Emperor Ahuitzotl, approximately 25 years old, respected for his courage and martial skill. He inherited a city ravaged by plague, its population halved, its leadership decimated, its granaries empty, its people traumatized and demoralized. He also inherited a war that was far from over, and an enemy who, having rested and resupplied in Tlaxcala, was preparing for a final reckoning. Smallpox came to Mexico with Panfilo de Narvaez's expedition in spring 1520. One of his men, Francisco de Eguia, a black slave according to some Spanish accounts, A regular soldier in others carried an active infection when the ships landed at Veracruz. When the expedition stopped at Chempoala, the coastal Totonac city, Iguia, fell ill. The locals tended to him, touching his fevered skin, breathing air he had exhaled, handling cloth he had touched. Within days they developed the telltale rash. Within weeks the infection spread west along trade routes, carried by merchants and runners, jumping from village to village faster than any army could march. While smallpox ravaged Tenochtitlan, Cortés spent the winter in Tlaxcala, rebuilding his forces. More Spaniards arrived from Cuba, and the Caribbean soldiers, adventurers, opportunists, drawn by tales of gold. He now commanded over 900 Spanish soldiers, 80 horsemen, 118 crossbowmen, and harquebusiers, and access to thousands of Tlaxcalan warriors. More importantly, he commissioned 13 brigantines, small warships equipped with cannons, to control Lake Texcoco. If Tenochtitlan's strength was its island position, Cortés would turn water into a weapon. The brigantines were built in Tlaxcala, disassembled, and carried piece by piece over the mountains by 8,000 indigenous porters. They would be reassembled on the lakeshore and launched against the city. Cortés also sent emissaries to every city-state in the Valley of Mexico, offering alliance, join us against Tenochtitlan or share its fate. Many accepted. They had paid tribute to the Aztecs for decades. They had sent their children to be sacrificed. Now the opportunity for vengeance had arrived, and they seized it. By May 1521, Cortés commanded not just Spaniards but a coalition army numbering perhaps 200,000 indigenous warriors. The final assault on Tenochtitlan would not be Spanish versus Aztec. It would be Mesoamerica versus Tenochtitlan, with the Spanish providing leadership, technology, and ruthless determination. On the 22nd of May 1521, the siege began. Cortés divided his forces into 3 groups, each assigned to a causeway leading into Tenochtitlan. Pedro de Alvarado commanded 30 horsemen and 25,000 Tlaxcalans on the Tacuba causeway to the west. Cristobal de Olid held Coyoacan to the south with 20,000 indigenous allies. Gonzalo de Sandoval secured Iztapalapa to the east with 30,000 warriors. The 13 brigantines patrolled the lake, cutting off Aztec canoes and supply routes. Tenochtitlan was surrounded, isolated, starving. Cuauhtémoc's strategy was defensive. His warriors contested every inch of the causeways, using the canals as natural fortifications. They removed bridges, forcing the Spanish to fill gaps with rubble. When the Spanish advanced, Aztec warriors in canoes attacked from both sides, firing arrows and hurling javelins. At night, the Aztecs rebuilt what the Spanish had destroyed during the day. Progress was measured in meters, paid for in lives. The brigantines proved decisive. Spanish warships dominated the lake, sinking Aztec canoes, cutting off fishing and supply routes. Tenochtitlan's food supply shrank to nothing. The freshwater aqueduct from Chapultepec was severed. Residents drank brackish lake water and contracted dysentery. They ate weeds, leather, mud, anything to stay alive. Cortés employed a tactic of systematic destruction. As Spanish and indigenous forces advanced down the causeways, they demolished every building they passed, houses, temples, palaces, filling canals with rubble to create solid paths for cavalry and to deny Aztec warriors positions from which to attack. Block by block, Tenochtitlan was dismantled. The fighting was savage from the first day. Aztec warriors adapted quickly to Spanish tactics. Learning from their earlier defeats, they avoided open ground where Spanish cavalry could charge effectively. They scattered when they heard cannons being positioned, denying the Spanish mass targets. They even began tying captured Spanish steel blades to long poles. creating weapons their enemies genuinely feared, Aztec strength and courage combined with European metallurgy. But adaptation could not overcome starvation or the mathematics of siege warfare. Cuauhtémoc's warriors fought on empty stomachs, their strength waning daily. They had no access to the chinampas outside the city, which Spanish forces had seized. Fishing was impossible. Brigantines controlled the lake. Any canoe that ventured out was sunk, its occupants killed or captured. The freshwater aqueduct from Chapultepec had been severed in the first days of the siege. Residents drank brackish lake water despite knowing it would sicken them with dysentery. Within weeks, the water sickness spread through the city, adding another layer of misery to starvation. Children died first. Their small bodies had no reserves to draw on. They grew listless, stopped crying, and simply faded away in their mother's arms. The elderly stopped eating entirely, giving their meager portions to younger family members, then lying down to die with dignity rather than prolong the inevitable. Warriors who had once been able to fight for hours, now tired after minutes, their muscles wasted, their bodies consuming themselves for fuel. By July, Tenochtitlan's defenders were eating grass pulled from cracks in stones. They chewed tree bark until their gums bled and their teeth loosened. They hunted rats in ruined buildings. Some accounts disputed by modern historians, but recorded by Spanish chroniclers, claim cannibalism occurred. Though whether this was actual practice, ritual, or Spanish propaganda designed to dehumanize the Aztecs remains unclear. What is undeniable is the descent into horror. Corpses lay unburied in the streets because the living lacked strength to move them. Summer heat accelerated decomposition. Flies swarmed in clouds so thick they darkened the air. The smell sweet, putrid, overwhelming, permeated everything. Spanish soldiers advancing down the causeways wrapped cloth soaked in vinegar around their faces, but nothing could keep out the stench of a city dying on its feet. Disease spread again through the siege. Dysentery from contaminated water turned deadly when combined with starvation. Festering wounds had no clean water for washing, no medicine for treatment. Infection killed as surely as Spanish swords. Respiratory illnesses moved through the crowded, weakened population. Bodies that might have fought off sickness in normal times simply surrendered. Yet the Aztecs fought on. Every meter of causeway cost Spanish and indigenous lives. Warriors defended barricades until they were overrun, then fell back to new positions. At night, they rebuilt what the Spanish had destroyed during the day, filling in rubble causeways, re-erecting barriers, preparing new ambush points. Women and children who could still move carried stones to the front lines, prepared food from what little remained, tended the wounded, knowing medicine could do almost nothing. Cortés grew frustrated with the slow pace. His forces advanced meters per day, paid for in Spanish lives he could not easily replace. So he changed tactics. Rather than simply driving toward the center of the city, his forces began systematically demolishing every building they passed. Spanish soldiers and indigenous allies tore down houses, temples, palaces, anything that stood. They used the rubble to fill canals, creating solid paths for cavalry and artillery. Stone by stone, Tenochtitlan was dismantled and used to build the roads of its own destruction. The demolition served multiple purposes. It denied Aztec warriors defensive positions, buildings from which to ambush, rooftops from which to hurl stones and spears. It created psychological pressure, showing the defenders that even if they survived, their city would not. And it filled the canals that had been Tenochtitlan's defining feature, transforming a water city into a wasteland of rubble. By August, most of Tenochtitlan lay in ruins. The sacred precinct, where the Templo Mayor had stood for centuries, was now a jumble of broken stone. The palace of Moctezuma, where Cortés had once been hosted with gold and women and hope for peace, collapsed into rubble. Markets that had bustled with 60,000 traders fell silent, their platforms destroyed, their vendors dead or fled. The chinampas that had fed the city for 200 years lay abandoned, their crops rotting, their wooden frames sagging into lake water. Cuauhtémoc and his remaining forces, perhaps 10,000 warriors out of the 100,000 who had begun the siege, retreated to Tlatelolco, the northern district of the city. There, in an ever-shrinking perimeter, they made their final stand. Cortés sent messages to Cuauhtémoc, "Surrender, and you will be spared. Your life will be guaranteed. You can continue as a symbolic leader under Spanish authority. Your people will not be massacred." Cuauhtémoc sent messages back. "We will fight until no one remains. We will defend our city to the last warrior, the last stone, the last breath. Death is preferable to submission." On the 13th of August 1521, Spanish forces and their indigenous allies breached the final Aztec defenses in Tlatelolco. What followed was not battle, but massacre. Warriors too weak to lift their weapons were cut down where they stood. Civilians attempting to surrender were killed indiscriminately. Spanish soldiers and indigenous allies were beyond mercy, beyond restraint, consumed by months of frustration and the blood madness that takes soldiers in siege's final hours. Spanish chroniclers describe having to walk across corpses because the ground itself was buried under bodies stacked several deep. Bernal Diaz del Castillo, who fought in the siege, later wrote, "The dry land and the stockades were piled with corpses, and our men could not walk except among bodies and heads of dead Indians. The stench was so bad that no one could endure it. The canals that had once carried flowers and produce now choked with the dead 40,000 bodies floating in water that had sustained life for centuries. The Spanish tried to burn corpses to reduce disease, but there were too many. They tried to bury them, but the lake was all around and the ground was stoned. Finally, they simply accepted the horror, accepted walking through decomposing bodies, accepted the stench, accepted that Tenochtitlan had become an open graveyard where the dying stepped over the dead." On the 13th of August 1521, Cuauhtémoc attempted to flee across the lake in a canoe with his family and remaining nobles. Spanish brigantines intercepted them. The emperor was hauled aboard and brought before Cortés. According to Spanish accounts, Cuauhtémoc asked Cortés to kill him, saying, "I have done what I was bound to do in defense of my city and my people. I can do no more. I am brought before you by force as a prisoner. Take that dagger from your belt and kill me with it." Cortés refused. Cuauhtémoc would live 4 more years as a puppet emperor under Spanish control before being hanged for alleged treason in 1525 during a Spanish expedition to Honduras. The siege of Tenochtitlan had lasted 93 days. Estimates of Aztec dead range from 100,000 to 240,000. Nearly all the nobility died, killed in battle, executed after surrender, or dead from disease and starvation. Most survivors were women and young children. The men, the warriors, the defenders, lay in canals or had been executed. The Spanish lost over 100 soldiers during the siege, though estimates vary. Their indigenous allies suffered catastrophic losses. The Tlaxcalans alone lost 30,000 warriors. These allies fought believing Spanish promises of liberation and regional dominance. They would discover that Spain had different plans. The gold Cortés sought was mostly gone, sunk during La Noche Triste, or distributed among too many men to matter. What remained, he sent to King Charles V, who was not impressed by the modest haul. The true wealth of the conquest was not gold but land, labor, and the precedent it set for future Spanish expansion. Tenochtitlan was razed. Temples were demolished to provide stone for Spanish colonial buildings. The canals were filled in. The causeways became roads. The chinampas were abandoned. Over the ruins, the Spanish built Mexico City, capital of New Spain, burying the Aztec Empire beneath cobblestones and cathedrals. The demographic collapse continued long after the siege ended. Smallpox returned in waves. Measles, typhus, and other diseases tore through indigenous populations with no immunity. Estimates suggest the population of central Mexico fell from 25 million before contact to approximately 3 million by 1568. Some regions lost 90% of their people. This was not intentional genocide in the modern sense the Spanish needed indigenous labor for mines and agriculture, but the result was the same: the near extermination of entire civilizations through disease, overwork, and violence. The encomienda system that replaced Aztec tribute treated indigenous workers as virtual slaves, forcing them to mine silver and grow crops for Spanish profit. Many died young, broken by labor they could not refuse. The Tlaxcalans, who had provided most of the indigenous warriors for the siege, found their reward bitter. Spanish promises of autonomy and partnership evaporated. Tlaxcala became part of New Spain, subject to Spanish law and tribute. The liberation they fought for became subjugation under a new master. La Malinche, who had translated between worlds, bore Cortés a son, Martin, then was married off to another Spaniard. Her name became a curse in Mexico, Malinchista, meaning traitor, someone who betrays their people for foreign favor. The historical La Malinche was a woman navigating survival in a world where women had few choices. The legendary La Malinche became a symbol of betrayal, convenient for blaming a woman rather than confronting the complexity of indigenous collaboration with Spanish conquest. Cortés returned to Spain in 1528, honored by the king, but denied the governorship he coveted. He was made Marquis of the Valley of Oaxaca, given estates and wealth, but never trusted with political power. He spent his final years involved in lawsuits, expeditions to California, and a campaign in Algeria that went nowhere. He died in 1547 at age 62, bitter that his greatest achievement had not brought greater rewards. The conquest of the Aztec Empire became a template for Spanish expansion throughout the Americas. The same tactics, forging alliances with subject peoples, exploiting internal divisions, using superior weaponry and cavalry, allowing disease to do much of the killing, would be employed against the Inca Empire, against the Maya, against indigenous peoples from Argentina to Arizona. Within a century, Spain controlled territories from California to Chile, extracting silver and gold, converting millions to Catholicism, and fundamentally reshaping the human landscape of two continents. But the destruction of Tenochtitlan holds lessons that transcend Spanish imperialism. It demonstrates how empires built on tribute and fear contain the seeds of their own destruction. The Aztecs ruled through military dominance and the constant extraction of resources from subject peoples. When an alternative appeared, even one as brutal as Spanish conquest, those same subjects chose to ally with the invader rather than defend the empire that had oppressed them for generations. It shows how disease can be as decisive as any army. Smallpox killed more Aztecs than all Spanish weapons combined. The epidemic broke the empire's leadership at the critical moment, leaving Tenochtitlan weakened and demoralized during the final siege. Biological warfare would become a feature of colonial conquest, sometimes accidental, sometimes deliberate, always devastating to populations with no immunity. It reveals how greed, Cortés's hunger for gold, can reshape entire civilizations. The Spanish did not arrive to enlighten or improve. They came to take. The gold they stole financed further conquest. The silver, extracted from Mexican and Andean mines in subsequent centuries, flooded European markets, triggering inflation, funding wars, and literally remaking the global economy. The resources plundered from the Americas built Spain into a superpower and made fortunes for merchants, bankers, and monarchs across Europe. And it teaches how propaganda can obscure truth. For centuries, the Spanish conquest was framed as the inevitable triumph of Christian civilization over pagan barbarism, as God's will, as proof of European superiority. Spanish chroniclers emphasized Aztec human sacrifice while downplaying Spanish atrocities. They portrayed Moctezuma as weak and Cortés as heroic. They claimed indigenous allies joined willingly rather than strategically. They invented the legend of Cortés as Quetzalcoatl to suggest the conquest was destined. The truth is messier. The Aztecs practiced human sacrifice on a scale that horrified even hardened conquistadors. But they also built one of the most sophisticated urban centers in the world, developed complex agricultural systems, created art and poetry of remarkable beauty, and engineered solutions to problems that would challenge modern cities. The Spanish brought Christianity and European law, but they also brought slavery, epidemic, disease, and centuries of colonial extraction that impoverished the very lands they claimed to civilize. Indigenous accounts written in Nahuatl, using the Roman alphabet, Spanish priests taught them paint a different picture than Spanish chronicles. They describe unarmed civilians massacred at Cholula. They recall Moctezuma as a strong ruler betrayed by circumstances, not a coward who surrendered. They document Spanish cruelty, greed, and treachery in detail. These voices, marginalized for centuries, are finally being heard by modern historians willing to question the conquistador narrative. Today, the ruins of the Templo Mayor stand in the heart of Mexico City, excavated in 1978 beneath colonial and modern buildings. Tourists can walk through the sacred precinct, see the sacrificial stones, touch the carved serpents that once adorned the pyramid's base. But the city that surrounded it, the canals, the causeways, the chinampas, the floating miracle that so amazed the Spanish is gone, buried under concrete and asphalt. 3 million people live in metropolitan Mexico City today. They walk streets that were once canals. They shop in markets built over plazas where Moctezuma once received tribute. The bones of Tenochtitlan lie beneath their feet, along with the bones of 200,000 people who died defending it. If you love this tale from history's shadows, subscribe and click the bell to hear more stories of empires that rose and fell, not because of destiny, but because of choices, because of greed, disease, and the terrible consequences of trust betrayed. Because history is not written by gods or fate, but by people making decisions in moments of crisis, and those decisions echo across centuries. The fall of the Aztec Empire began with a handshake on a causeway. It ended with corpses floating in canals. In between were choices: Moctezuma's choice to welcome Cortés, the Tlaxcalan's choice to ally with invaders, Alvarado's choice to massacre festival dancers, Cortés's choice to build brigantines and starve a city. None of these choices were inevitable. All of them were human. And humanity, as Tenochtitlan reminds us, is capable of building miracles and destroying them in equal measure, often for nothing more than gold we cannot eat and glory that fades with the telling